We are thrilled to be hosting tonight's program along with the Writers Foundry of St. Joseph's College in Brooklyn, Guernica Magazine, and the Polish Cultural Institute. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Michael Archer, who is the founder and editor-in-chief of Guernica Magazine. I hope you enjoy the evening.
We want to thank the Jewish Center as well as Penn, in particular, Jacob Orsos, Beth Weinstein, and Paul Morris. I'm the editor-in-chief of Guernica. We're an online magazine founded 9 years ago. We publish pieces, fiction, poetry, art, features, interviews that sort of meet the intersection of art and politics and culture and ideas, and we're at guernicamag.com. We've worked a lot with Penn in the past for World Voices, and it's always been really exciting. So we were thrilled this year when they approached us about an evening with Guernica. The sort of reservation came in finding out that we needed to come up with an idea for the event in a very short time. So we did what we normally do, which is open it up to a conversation with staff. And at the time, our then editor-in-chief, K.K. Nielsen, had just written and published a piece about a month prior that was a personal essay about, and I'm being broad here, egg donation. And she was surprised to find that in the comments from readers and also from friends and colleagues, that the piece was often, and she was often being described as brave, something synonymous to that. And this led to when we brought what we should do for the Penn event up, and especially because we ideally wanted it to have something to do with bravery, this led to Kay bringing this up in a discussion about gender and what it has to do with confessional writing in the way that we talk about it. And that led to this evening, which we're thrilled about. Before I introduce tonight's moderator, who is Guernica Daily's editor, Rachel Reeder, I want to tell you that the Panelist books will be for sale at the Penn World Voices pop-up bookstore, which is at the Public Theater. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Rachel Reeder, our moderator.
I want to thank all of Penn's festival's sponsors and supporters who make this possible, especially the Public Theater and the Standard, who are serving as festival hubs this year. There are also more than 100 volunteers who are making sure that all of these events go smoothly, and I want to thank them too. There are events all week. You can find out about them at www.worldvoicesfestival.org if you haven't already. Photos and videos from the events will be posted online as well. Anthony Swofford, in the middle there, is the author of Jarhead, which documents his time as a Marine in the First Gulf War. It won the Penn Martha Albrand Award for Memoir in 2004. And it gives a really vivid and darkly funny look at the world of war. In 2007, he published the novel Exit A, and last year released his memoir Hotels, Hospitals, and Jails, which deals with some conflicts that are closer to home. He covers his relationship with his father, becoming a father himself, and dealing with a streak of self-destruction that sometimes seems just as dangerous as war. We also have Trisha Low. Trisha is a poet whose work has appeared in Artifice magazine, Elective Affinities, and Apiary magazine, among many others. Trisha's work often perfectly captures the cadence of the way that we speak to each other, both in person and on the internet. And she does a neat trick where in this tone that sounds very familiar, she really pushes readers into uncomfortable territory. Her piece, Confessions, is a transcript of several confessions that she made to Catholic priests. They all begin the same way, and then take various turns that are sometimes funny and sometimes troubling, and often both. That appears in the anthology Against Expression and an anthology of conceptual writing. Benjamin Anastas, there on the end, is the author of the novels An Underachiever's Diary and The Faithful Narrative of a Pastor's Disappearance, which was a New York Times notable book. In 2012, he published his memoir Too Good to Be True, which begins at a time when his marriage has broken up, his career seems to be stalled, and he is literally scrounging for change to buy groceries. But things are looking up for Benjamin. He writes really unsparingly about the choices that brought him to that moment, and reading the book, you have the sense of being right there with someone who's grappling with some really hard truths. And next to me is Agata Tuszynska. She began her career as a journalist writing about theater and culture. She has published 6 collections of poetry, is that right? And many works of biography and literary reportage. 2 of her books are more personal. They are A Family History of Fear, which tells the stories of her Polish and Jewish ancestors, and Exercises in Loss, which talks about her husband's struggles with cancer. Her most recent book is Vera Grahn, The Accused, and it is a biography of a Polish singer who had a very glamorous life before the war, then was accused of being a Nazi collaborator, then exonerated. And when the book begins, she is speaking with Agata as an old woman who is experiencing dementia, and that the way that she's been portrayed has gotten the book a little bit of controversy, which we will talk about tonight. So thank you all for coming, and let's start talking about confessional writing. As Michael said, the idea for this panel came up because one of our editors published a piece about egg donation, and a lot of the response that she got was, rather than talking about the quality of the work, was saying to her personally, "You are so brave." And I wonder if that is something that happens more to women writers who write personal narratives, or if it happens to everyone. So I'd like to do a little very unscientific survey and ask all of you if you have been called brave for writing about your lives.
Where should we start? You want to start with me? Yeah, I was called brave just the other day, actually, in Massachusetts at the Newburyport Literary Festival. I think because I wrote about being broke, which is certainly here in the prosperity bubble. It's the subject that nobody really wants to talk about. I felt like there are very few taboos left in literature, even in memoir, and money is kind of the last taboo. Most of us lie about it, whether kind of openly or not so openly. And I found myself, due to circumstances, some of which are kind of my own making, like being an idiot and quitting jobs every time I got a book contract, that kind of thing. And also just because of the media retraction that happened in 2008, 2009, a lot of these magazines that I wrote for just kind of either went under or stopped hiring freelance writers. So most of my income kind of vanished. And it was strange to be living in New York at that time when a lot of people were going through a really similar time and nobody was talking about it. Everyone's kind of going on as usual. People would kind of slowly drop out. You think, oh, they left the city. So I did write about being broke quite openly, and I actually kind of wrote the memoir in real time. I started it at a very low point in my kind of what turned out to be my trajectory. And I was kind of writing the book by hand in real time as I was trying to figure out, like, how do I find work? How do I save my relationship? How do I spend more time with my son? How do I deal with this marriage that just kind of imploded? And I'm still kind of, putting together the pieces of it. I guess the upside is that people do think it's sort of brave to write about a subject that nobody really is open about. I promise I'll be quick. But the downside is that, man, the internet comments have been like harsh. I mean, just brutal. I mean, I think it's kind of funny actually, but you know, I think partly because I'm a man writing about being broke, there's a lot of venom that comes out. There was someone on Goodreads who actually kind of live tweeted the book. She hated it so much that she kind of live tweeted as she was reading along. She was like, "You're a loser. Get a job. Oh my God, he's borrowing money from his girlfriend on page 43. Get a job." So the one side is yes, there are people who think it's brave to write about a subject that not everybody's open about. The downside is it does leave you open to a lot of kind of criticism.
I don't think I've ever been called brave. I feel like that's a thing that really applies more in poetry anyway to, and I will say that my knowledge of fiction is sorely limited, sorry guys. But I think it applies more actually to male poets, if we can make that distinction, or it just seems that when male poets have this moment of vulnerability, it's like audiences want to reward them for it. Eileen Myles wrote this thing the other day for the Volta, which said, you know, poetry is the space where men can feel how women feel. And I think that's true to a certain degree, but there was certainly this like 90s identity politics movement where women were told that they were brave for sort of postulating this authentic quote-unquote subjecthood, and I think that that's sort of being pushed up against at this moment. I think that it's almost more taboo to not be brave, you know? I think that when one reads a memoir by a young girl, there's certain kinds of assumptions that come forward. You know, she's going to write about sex, she's going to write about her love life, she's going to write about her feelings, and all these things are just sort of cliched now. It's like, I love you, I hate you, let's get a Coke, right? But I'm interested in those moments. I'm interested in how those I love you, I hate you, like, let's get a Coke moments are actually displaced acts of listening. This idea that you are actually replicating a literary trauma that's been done to you. So I guess I'm not super interested in being brave. I feel like that moment has really passed. Yeah.
I've been called brave. I've also been called many other things, some of which I can't repeat here. But when my first book came out, it happened that, you know, I'd written very honestly and I suppose viscerally about going to war and being in combat as a 20-year-old kid with boots in the desert. And we, as a country, were just about to go to war again in that same place. And so my book became part of that larger cultural conversation. And so I think sometimes to call any piece of writing brave is a shorthand way to distance ourselves a bit from what's really happening there. For instance, you know, Ben's book is about financial failure and the kinds of decisions that led him there. And my last book was about financial failure and the decisions that led me there. I think I was probably called stupid for that book and not ever brave. But I think that any kind of act of memoir writing, confessional writing, writing that is attempting to narrate a personal moment, a personal journey, and then make it universal, because those are the kinds of books that we'll really read about and that will become part of the conversation. I would imagine that Ben's live tweeter was probably deeply engrossed in the book and afraid, very afraid of something that she was reading in order to react that way. I think
generous interpretation.
No, I think so. Yeah, I think when you know, I love it when if someone's like, "Oh yeah, that was a pretty good book." If they're either I love it or I hate it, I'll go read it. Even if someone says I hated that book, I'll probably pick it up before I hear someone say, "Ah, it was a pretty good book." So brave every once in a while, stupid as well.
Well, I think this is my case as well. I was called brave many times, and not for one, but at least for two, if not for three of my books. So, first book, I don't think I actually was so brave. The word brave for me belongs to the war, belongs to the different circumstances. So when I wrote my book called Family History of Fear, I revealed a secret. It was a very deep secret of my family. I didn't know for 19 years that my mother was Jewish. She never told me that. She told me that when I was 19, and I was so shocked and so afraid that I didn't know what to do with this information. So I decided to stay on her Polish papers for several more years. And then I'm Polish, I'm a Polish Jew, I would say. And I was born and I still live in Poland. So when I finally decided to talk about my Jewishness, about my mother being Jewish, about my family being in a Warsaw ghetto, about the loss, about the humiliation, about all those horrible parts of me and my identity, people called me brave. I didn't feel like that, but I have to say that I'm not afraid anymore, as I was afraid being in Poland and feeling like my mother felt, feeling being constantly in this weird state of fear. When I decided to write this book, it was a liberation for me. And for other people who read it, I had many, many letters after this book, and people called me brave because they still cannot reveal this secret. They still think that saying that you are Jewish in Poland, it's maybe not dangerous, but there's something that you are not proud of it. I'm now proud of it. So this was the work of building my own identity. I'm not going to talk a lot about the second book. I wasn't called brave. I was rather this book was either accepted as a great book or hated as a horrible book. Because in Poland we still don't talk about illness and terminal illness and death. So the reception was, I will talk about it maybe later, but also why I was called brave. My last book talks about a Jewish Holocaust survivor, a singer from the Warsaw Ghetto, Vera Graham, who was accused after the war of being a collaborator. And the great mentor of mine, Jerzy Giedroyć, the editor-in-chief of the Kultura in Paris, told me, don't write about that because you'll be hated by Poles and by Jews. And he was right. And some people call me brave because I talk about this, and I talk about Warsaw Ghetto and the coffee shops and the boîte and the restaurants and the champagne and everything, and Jewish collaborators also. So this is a taboo subject. We don't talk about it. The Jews don't talk about it. It's not good. But if you decided to do it, they call you brave or they call you stupid.
I'd love to hear about the process of making that decision, of actually deciding to write something in which you reveal a family secret or a personal secret, or decide to tell the world you're broke. What do you think about? What are you sort of weighing when you make those choices?
Well, I think it's not like a decision. You just have to do it. And all those 3 books, especially Family History of Fear, it was a necessity for me as a person and as a writer. I wrote a lot of biographies before, and I was writing about different people. But here, I said, well, I treated those people like a memoirs. I was regarding and I was trying to answer the questions that I had myself by telling stories of other people. And finally, I couldn't live with my secret anymore. Being Jewish in Poland and having this secret, I couldn't speak about it. I don't know why, I cannot tell you why. And also, here New York helped, I have to say. When I came to New York as a Fulbright scholar 22 years ago, I started to talk about it because I've seen so many different people in this city, different nationalities, different religions. Also, I saw Jewish professors and doctors and academics, and I had Jewish friends. So I said, well, you might be proud to be Jewish. It's not something horrible as I thought, being in Warsaw and in Poland, and seeing how my mother and her family is afraid and doesn't want to talk about it, doesn't want to have any memoirs of the past. So again, this is a necessity. You have to do it. You don't decide, okay, today I'll write this book. This is just a way it happens.
Is that true for the rest of you also, that it feels necessary rather than like a choice?
Yeah, I'll talk about my last book, which I took 3 RV trips with my father while I was writing it kind of in real time. I didn't know what this book would be, but I was nearing 40 and my life was kind of falling apart. And I'd had what I call a reverse midlife crisis. I blew a bunch of money and I was a philanderer and I wrecked a car, but I was single when I did all of that, and then I was about to turn 40 and I thought, wow, I want to get married and have a kid. And my father had done the opposite. My father had the classic midlife crisis. And the thing that I knew was that my father had been a philandering jerk throughout his marriage to my mother. And I'd begun to understand that in my 20s, and I knew it even more in my 30s, when he wanted to unburden himself with all of these dalliances that he'd had over the years, which is a really bad idea, all of you men out there, and you women too. But because I know women are brave and they also cheat on their spouses, but that's a different panel. But so I had this information, and I took some videos of my father, and I circled around this chapter. I knew it had to be a chapter, and it happened in the desert, and I wrote my way around it, and I knew all of the cities where my father had done his philandering, and I didn't want to put it in the book. And my parents are long divorced, and at some level my mother must have known all of this, and they're friends now, but I knew that it sort of had to be in the book because I was trying to understand myself through my father's behavior. And in the end, I essentially transcribed this video of my father in his RV going through all of the cities in the world where he had cheated on my mother, and asking me if it counted if he cheated on my mother in Copenhagen. And I said, yeah, it does. Does it count in Barcelona? And I said, yeah, Barcelona counts, I think. He said, does it count in Saigon? And I was like, I don't know, maybe Saigon doesn't count, because I know you were in Vietnam at war. And so they said, well, does Tokyo count? And I said, well, that depends. Was it in 69 or 76? And I had to put that in the book, and I was afraid of putting it in the book, but it became a necessity. And I had what I thought was a complete manuscript, and that chapter was missing. And so then I was able to quote my father directly and indict him directly. And we haven't really talked much since that book came out. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, Dad.
I guess my answer to that would be more like, you don't know if I'm lying. I think that there's this impulse when one talks about confessional writing that one has to write a true story to assert some kind of identity, as though it were more authentic than any other kind of fiction. It has this sort of like reparative signifying function, especially from the 50s when you're thinking about that sort of like move from thinking about an individual to it being applied universally. I think that sometimes I think it's dangerous that we think about confessional writing as being brave in a certain way, because like as a good friend of mine, Joseph Cathell, would say, a poem or a story is not going to loot a footlocker. Like it's not actually going to do anything. That's not the function that it serves as an aesthetic object, you know? So I think it's interesting to think about if a piece of confessional writing isn't really doing anything in the physical world, then what is its function, really? I mean, I'm interested in thinking about the confessional as more manipulative than that, right? In a way, like, if we think about the confessional as a feminine mode of writing, sure, like, that's the way it's been characterized over the years, right? Then it's the only way that I'm allowed to write because I'm a person who identifies necessarily as feminine. But then within that, is there a mode of manipulation that I can carry out? That's the way that I would like to think about it.
Right. It's interesting that we're talking about bravery sort of in terms of what are the consequences that this piece of writing creates in the real life of the author, not what does the text do with the reader, which is...
Yeah, I guess and maybe this is something that sets me apart a little bit from everybody else who's speaking, is that like I'm more interested in thinking about the confessional as a formal space, as a genre. If I'm allowed to get really nerdy for a second, I guess like when I think about confessional writing, I think back to the 18th century, and that's the moment that I really think it arose, because what happened is that living space became really complicated, and people had these spaces just for writing. They were called cabinets, and they were typically inhabited by women who, it was a domestic space, and they would go in there and they'd write their diaries and things like that. And Pamela, which is a novel written by Richardson, is this idea, it's based around this idea of the servant girl going into this small space and writing this confessional story of what happened to her. So maybe a way to think about the confessional would be for it to be more of like a fantasy of what a private life should be, or even a fantasy of what a feminine private life would be, right? And that's a sort of very interesting tension for me to think about. What's real, what's not? Is it important that I say what's real and something that's confessional if it's treated like a fiction anyway? Or at least it's manipulated by men as a fiction sometimes, right? It's just one of those things.
I think that's interesting. I think that's one kind of confessional writing, but the truth is, you know, I was thinking about this panel and thinking about confession, and to me, the whole idea of confession is intimately bound up with autobiography, period. You know, if you look back to sort of the first model we have for autobiography in the West, it's actually called Confessions. You know, Augustine's Confessions from the year 398. And I think most of what we understand, or most of what we assume we're going to get when we pick up an autobiography or a memoir or confessional work is kind of follows the formula that Augustine set out, which is that here we are writing from a later place, looking back at an earlier time when we sinned, when we did wrong, when we were weak, when we didn't understand everything that we know now. And I think for Augustine, he was writing after a conversion experience. So it was literally like he was a sinner before and now he's not. But I think for those of us who are secular writers, we're trying to reach a place of understanding, often through writing, as opposed to sort of like having understanding come to us as we hear, a child's voice underneath a tree. So I think we expect confession in most of our autobiography, and certainly from our memoir. So it's intimately bound up with the whole thing. I've been reading Walden again for a course I'm teaching, and I find like a chapter like the bean fields to be incredibly. To me it's a work of confession. Here's like Thoreau's talking about his intimate connection with these beans, with these rows of beans. Like people aren't supposed to feel this strongly about their beans, And he says, elsewhere in the book, if I am not I, who will be? And to me, like that's sort of the ultimate confession. You're confessing who you are, what you care about, what your concerns are, and that's always going to be kind of dangerous and a little bit shocking, I think.
I'm curious about how you guys balance when you're writing yourself as a character, how you balance the necessity to tell a true story, tell a story that is maybe ugly, and whether you feel like there's also an urge to make yourself look good if you want to be likable, or if you have to put that desire to represent yourself in a positive way aside, or how that informs the process that you go through when you're writing about yourself. Anyone?
I think, every writer wants to be loved and admired, and that's part of the disease and part of the problem. When you're writing a novel, when you're writing a poem, when you're writing a memoir, if you are kind of, I guess if you're going to write a book that's going to be interesting to people outside of your small circle, you're going to have to tell some unvarnished truths and expose yourself as the sort of small, petty person that we all are at times. And sometimes that's about sex, sometimes that's about money, sometimes that's about family. And I think that's what makes readers respond to what today we call memoir. Trisha mentioned fantasy, and to think about the reader, isn't that what the act of reading is about? It's about entering this fantasy, and even if they know that it's true, that it's an autobiography, there's still, as writers, we must create and render a world that is believable, and we must put ourselves on stage with others who are real people, who live these events with us. And at least the pressure today, I think, is to be as honest as one can be about oneself in order for that to reverberate.
I don't have a problem with myself in my writing. I have rather the problem with others. Let's say my parents, for example. I wrote this book when they were alive. They are still alive. And I had a real difficulties with both of them. I had to come to America to write this book because I couldn't stand their breath on my neck. I couldn't write because I was seeing them like checking, if their images are ideal or if they look good or not. So I don't correct myself, and I don't think about what I look like in my writing for others. I'm trying to tell my story. You said true story. I don't know if it's a true story, it's my truth. My mother's truth is different and my father's is different. My parents are also divorced, so those stories are even more different. And what is important, I think, in this kind of writing is to write the truth, my truth, and then to wait a little and make it cold. Because if you write about yourself, it's a very hot writing, you know what I mean? It's full of feelings and passions, etc., etc. Then you let it be for a while and put an ice on it. It has to be cold, to be good for you, good for the readers, ready to go, and only then you can move your readers, not crying on each page. You have to make your readers cry.
I guess I'll tell an anecdote to make myself seem more likable to the audience. Thanks, guys. I read the Confessions piece maybe a year ago at a gathering of University of Pennsylvania prospective parents, And I've never felt the force of so much hatred come towards me. It was like every parent in the room was just like, please let my daughter not grow up to be this. Like, please.
Tell us a little more about that piece.
Blood?
No, I didn't spit blood at that reading. I refrained. Sometimes I do that. I mean, they're pretty true to detailed transcripts of what happened. I took a tape recorder into 5 confessionals. I tape recorded my conversations with the priests. I gave the same confession every time, but of course, you know, it involved certain unattractive, un-Catholic aspects of my activities and my person. And it was interesting because it was the priests who didn't know how to deal with the situation. They were the ones who started stuttering, and my confession was sort of really on par because in a sense, like, it's already so scripted that it really threw off the structure that I was engaging with. But I guess maybe I'm interested in exaggerating the sort of social positionality that I place myself in, the unattractive aspects of that, to engage an audience. I feel like, you know, in that setting, facing a group of parents as you know, someone who was a college student and who has done this work and has done well for it, in a sense, it really complicates their understandings and fantasies of what a successful writer should even be like, let alone a successful young woman, you know? And it's that sort of complexity that I'm interested in engaging with, making people really uncomfortable with their own fantasies when they're sort of faced with my work, I guess.
I want to back up to what you said about hot and cold writing, and I'm wondering if any of you are interested in making the case for hot writing, for not letting your feelings cool off before you send out a piece. Or are we all in agreement?
I think it's called bad writing.
I'm in agreement with Agata. I think to let it cool is probably good. To write it hot is important, and but that can only last for so long. I mean, for me, it only lasts about 6 weeks, and then I'm defeated. I watch movies, try to write poems. But yeah, to let it cool, I think, is always good.
I think one of the reasons why we all seem pretty uncomfortable with the whole kind of bravery label is because, you know, I think this is another thing that you probably all agree with. Like, the writer has the instinct to go for the things that nobody is saying, that nobody is acknowledging, particularly in families, but also in sort of countries and societies. And it's almost as if it's out of your control. And so what feels natural to you is to expose something to light that nobody wants to hear. So simultaneously, you want to be loved for it, but at the same time knowing that, you know, there are a lot of people who will not love you for it. So there's the weird kind of dichotomy there. So, but I think ideally, everything that the writer seeks out is going to be hot and stay hot. But I think the key is to try to treat it dispassionately, treat it coolly, treat it like a material to be kind of shaped. You know, this is where manipulation comes in, which is part of any kind of writing, even if you're writing about reality. If you do not manipulate reality, nobody will want to read what you're writing because, you know, they'll just be snowed by like the sheer volume of life that you're giving them, and nobody wants that. You know, I mean, they want you to be a writer.
Well, I think it's kind of obvious that we choose from reality. So even if each of you want to describe us, you do it differently. You use different words and different sentences, and it's kind of obvious. So there's no like absolute true writing or true story. Even photography is a choice.
I mean, I'm not really for hot writing, but I'm for bad writing. No, really though. I feel like, well, I'm working with all of this ephemera that I have, sort of like suicide notes I wrote when I was a teenager up until this point, and sort of like romance novels and pulp fiction and detective fiction and all that fun language. But I think that there's something to a narrative or prose that's really violent, in a sense, like it tries to domesticate something that's almost a threat, like it's almost neutralizing in a way. So I'm for bad writing. I'll just say that.
Okay. To read or to use in to use in future work or.
No, I'm for that sort of sloppy, bad, not at all ritualistic writing. I feel like that's something that's even a threat to the way that writing is being done, or the way that certain kinds of narratives about lives or about identities are being told. I feel like there's a sort of formula there that can be disrupted, or that I'm interested in disrupting.
But to be bad, it still has to be. I think you have to work hard to be bad, right?
No, I totally agree with you. I think
That's a formal choice
yeah,
that you're
no,
making,
it's a formal
which makes
choice.
you. Yeah. Well, it comes naturally to some.
I just, there's a chapter in my memoir which I wrote, it's a letter to my ex-wife's boyfriend. There's another writer who I call the nominee, because he was nominated for this literary award that he didn't win. On the night he got together with my wife, so I called the nominee in the book. And it was a very cathartic experience to write this thing, and I kept on thinking, well, I'll just take it out. When I finish the book, I'll just take it out. But of course, I decided it became such a crucial part of the book that I never took it out. I will say, as far as reviewers were concerned, that was the chapter that was really super controversial. Some reviewers said this should not be in the book. Other reviewers said it's sort of the best part of the book. To me, the book is there wouldn't be a book without it. But it was very much hot material that I think a more virtuous writer would have left out.
But it is. I think it is hot material, but it also, as you said, it's a really important part of the story, and you are leaving it in, I think, tells a story itself, right? The fact that it is hot material tells us stuff about you and tells your story, I think, more richly. Would you like to say something?
Well, yes, I want to say that this is the material, but we're using life as a material, but we make it into writing, good writing, I think. I gave my memoir, The Family History of Fear, to my parents before the publication. And they read it, they felt offended, especially my father. But they say, okay, you're still our daughter. And someone asked me, what would you do if they would say no to the publication? And I said, of course, I would publish it anyhow. So I have a question for you, different question. What do you think about the word betrayal in this context? I think it's important because I felt in this book like I'm betraying my family, like I'm selling, quote unquote, family secrets. I am revealing something that at least part of my family, my mother's family, my Jewish family, they didn't want anybody to know. The war was over, and my mother decided she would never be this little girl from the ghetto, and she will never be called a Jew, and she will never feel like Treblinka is built for her and for her family. So she wanted to forget. And whoever survived wanted to forget. And here I am, many, many years later, in Poland, like in Europe, in the middle of Europe, and I decided for my own purpose, because I cannot stand the secret, to reveal it to everyone. Isn't it not a betrayal? And also I'm talking about my father. You said about your father, let's say nasty thing about your father. I said also things about my father that were very difficult for me as his daughter, but also for him now. And my father was a public figure in Poland, so a very well-known radio sports broadcaster. So for him it was even worse, because everybody knew whom I am referring to, who is my father. So what do you think about this aspect of this kind of writing?
Well, my betrayal was of my father was localized. It wasn't. It didn't have the backdrop of Nazi atrocities, say. But the question is probably less important for the writer's subjects than it is for the writer. Like, if you had that information and as a writer you didn't use it, you didn't write it, you know, the biggest betrayal probably would have been betraying yourself. And you know, often I hear writers, sometimes writers who write a lot of books, and sometimes writers who are trying to write books, who say, yeah, I'd love to write this book about my father, but I'm gonna have to wait until he dies. And I always say, why? Like, go write that book now, write against that. I'd be more interested to know what you produce, knowing that that person is alive, whoever it is that you're writing about, and whether or not they think about it as a betrayal, it's probably more important what you think about it as a betrayal. I don't know. Either of you?
Sure, well, sort of betrayal is something or feelings of betrayal or something I struggled a lot when I was working on my book. In part because I was writing about a time when I was first born, or very young, in my parents' lives, and when things were not good. My mother was suicidally depressed, and as a whole family, we had to go to this kind of experimental treatment center where they hung signs around her neck, and that's where the title comes from, Too Good to Be True. I was a 3-year-old, I had to wear this little sign that said Too Good to Be True. My brother had to wear a sign that said Mr. Know-It-All. My sister had to wear a little sign that said Cry Baby. And it was a painful experience for us. I mean, not like this kind of horrible recovered memory thing, you know, but it never felt good to think about it. And I know it was hard for our parents to remember this, because they knew it was painful for us. So I did struggle with feelings of betrayal, but, you know, I would console myself with, you know, George Orwell's words in Why I Write, which is, he says of writers are vain, selfish, and lazy, and at the bottom of their motives there lies a mystery. And now I think, okay, writers are vain, selfish, and lazy. At the bottom of their motives there lies a mystery.
Yeah, I don't know about lazy.
Yeah, I mean, you know, in this sort of big project that I've done, where I work with a lot of suicide notes that I've written to my parents and stuff, I've definitely had feelings of betrayal. My sister has read them, and this has led to kind of like pretty big real world consequences for our relationship and stuff like that. But and I have a whole intellectualized argument about how this is really about like nuclear family structure, and like this is really about me being unwilling to like neutralize like what's socially unfit for consumption or whatever. But that's, you know, I think part of what makes the project interesting is that it does have that real world stakes to it. And I think it's that affect that comes through this sort of like between the sort of standardized cliched language of like I'm a teenager and I want to kill myself, like there's something that's still really emotionally affecting and intense about it because of that. And I think, yeah, I mean, betrayal is something that's difficult, but it's something that families also do all the time in different ways.
That's such a good point. Any other thoughts on betrayal?
I've been reading this fantastic memoir called My Brother by Jamaica Kincaid. I don't know if anybody has read that. I mean, she is completely unsparing in the way she describes her family. It's about, she has a brother who's dying of AIDS in Antigua, who she stopped, didn't really know very well. She stopped seeing him when he was 3 years old. She moved away. And you know, she describes her mother, which is an incredibly manipulative woman, who literally, her mother left, the brother who ended up dying of AIDS much later in Jamaica Kincaid's care when she was 13 years old. And all Jamaica Kincaid, as a 13-year-old, wanted to do was read. She'd literally steal books from the library. And she didn't really care about this younger brother because her mother kept on having these kids, and it meant less for her. You know, she would have to give things up, including going to school. Every time these little boys would show up. So she ignores her brother the whole day, and she reads instead. And when the mother comes home, there's like this brick of feces in his diapers. And in retaliation, her mother goes to the house and takes every single book that the young Jamaica Kincaid has and takes them outside and burns them. It's a completely unsparing book, and I can't imagine that Jamaica Kincaid spoke to her mother again after she published this book. But I just feel like the writer has the responsibility. You know, if you've lived through this experience, you have the responsibility to tell.
I heard also the word betrayal concerning my writing and my book about Vera Grant, The Accused. The book is about a star of a Warsaw ghetto, about a young, beautiful woman who was a great singer before the war and who decided to be a singer during the war. I am meeting this woman in 2003 when she's really old, and spent with her almost 4 years talking about her life and about her work in a ghetto and about all the accusations that came later, etc., etc. And in my book starts with the image of this old woman and this terrifying little studio in Paris, which looks like a banker in a ghetto, when she's by herself, all alone, living with her memory, obsessed with them, half crazy, sick. And I'm giving this image. Am I allowed to do it? Am I betraying this young, beautiful star? Is it okay to show her like this? And I'm with her till the end of her life, when she's sick and old, and when she's wearing diapers, and when she's slowly going away. Would she be happy with these images? So did I have right to do it? And I think here is a question of the purpose of this narrative. As my New York psychiatrist used to say, what is the purpose of this narrative, madam? So what was the purpose of using these images and describing this old woman? And then the second thing is the quality of writing, I think. If it's a good writing, you can do almost everything.
I like that, the idea that a good enough piece of writing makes the betrayal okay. I think that's good. I think it's also interesting that at the beginning of that book, you transcribe, it feels like word for word, the conversation that you have with her about this project. And so the reader gets to see your subject's reluctance and hear her reservations. And at one point she says something really wonderful like, "You think I should agree to talk to you just because you had the idea to write about me?" But you get to have that negotiation, and I think that's sort of an advantage that writers of reported pieces have, where if you're really writing from your own life, probably you never sit down and say to the people around you, the conversations we've been having for the last 5 years, they're my intellectual property now, okay?
Well, Vera Grant was even worse. You said that it was a negotiation. It was really hard negotiation because for the first 3 or 4 weeks she was keeping me on the landing in front of her apartment. He didn't want to let me in. But she was really horrible. She was horrible to me, but I decided I want to talk to her because I think it's important. She's a witness of the period of the war. She was in the ghetto, and my mother was in the ghetto, so she's another source of information and feelings, and she can give me back the time that I didn't experience. That's why I will talk to her on the landing, wherever she will let me in. She let me in afterwards, and I am with her in this little bunker, hiding for another almost 3 years. So yes, I negotiated, but and she didn't want me on one hand, but she needed me on the other hand, because she wanted someone who will come and finally write the story, write her story. Because I don't know if you know, 2 artists survived from this little boîte, sztuka, art from Warsaw Ghetto. One was Władysław Szpilman, the hero of Polański movie, and another one was Vera Grant, the singer from the same place. They were working together for 1.5 years, and he was writing songs for her. So the whole world knows his story because of Polański. So now, hopefully, the world will know also her story, and her story is completely different. Because Szpilman stayed in Warsaw, he was in good terms with the communists, he did his career in the Polish radio, and he had a good life. And she was accused of being a collaborator and finally banned from Poland. She left Poland 5 years after the war, went to Israel, where nobody wanted her because she was apparently a Nazi collaborator. And then she was traveling all over the world, finally stayed in Paris. But wherever she went, the label collaborator went with her, and she was terrified. Her life was completely ruined by that. So she wanted someone who would come, listen to her story, which she repeated over and over again, but nobody wanted to listen to her. And then we'll make it public. And I'm happy that I did it, because I think it's an incredible story, and on many, many levels. How was it possible to be a singer in a ghetto? How was it possible to survive and be accused of collaboration? She wasn't a collaborator. Then I'm asking myself the question, what does it mean to collaborate? What did she do? Maybe she was just a woman who wanted to survive. The man who survived, he had to really collaborate to be called a collaborator. With women, it's not the same. She did something, maybe. And another thing, which is very important in this story, we cannot judge those people. They wanted to live. Every single day they had to survive, to escape the death. So, Vera wanted me to tell the story to the world, and I did it. That's why I think that the purpose was good. So I don't feel I betrayed her. On the contrary, I feel that now the book is translated into 8 languages. So in 8 languages, people can learn about her and know her story.
Yeah, betrayal in a reported piece is much different than, I think, in a memoir. And when you're dealing with family, if you're reporting, it's a reported piece about a public figure, or not even a public figure, even a private figure. I don't know that I would be. I'm always happy to betray myself, and I'm still not totally comfortable with betraying my father. That knowledge that I have his life, that in some ways he offered to me. He did offer to me in private moments, and to make myself feel better. I always thought of the Joan Didion quote, which is, writers are constantly selling someone out. And my father didn't get that memo. But at any rate, yeah, the idea of betrayal, as Agata was talking, it's very different if it's a reported piece and it's a piece of biography.
I think it's super interesting, actually, with reported pieces or biographical pieces that people do, how much their own personal investments show up. Sometimes I feel like those pieces are more confessional than the kinds of confessional writing that I'm interested in writing about myself. There's this really extraordinary piece that a grad student wrote about Sylvia Bataille-Khan, I don't know if you guys, she's sort of, she was kind of an academic in her own right, but she first married Georges Bataille, and then after she divorced him, married Lacan, and she's been this sort of like mysterious cipher for a lot of academics, and this grad student finally got in touch with her over the phone, and when you read his piece, you can see that it's really his investments that are showing. He speaks to her, I think, for about a minute every month for like 3 months, and then goes to Paris, and on the day that he's supposed to finally meet her, shows up at her door and presses the buzzer, and it turns out that she had passed away on that morning. And so the whole piece is really about his engagement with this figure that becomes amorphous. Someone who really just becomes a part of his own confession in a way. And I like that about reported pieces. Like, I like trying to locate where the writer's actual own investments are and what they're saying about themselves and talking about someone else.
I have sort of Oprah question for Agata. I wonder if, did you write the book about the singer you were describing after the book you wrote about your family?
Yes.
I wonder if on some level you were perhaps writing that as not as a kind of penance, but you felt you betrayed your family with the first book, and then with this book you could actually tell this woman's story and release the kind of the mantle of collaborator from her shoulders. Take the big C off of her chest.
Redemption, maybe. This is a work for my psychoanalyst, I think.
Because we'd all like to be virtuous, but it's hard when you're a writer to be virtuous. Because part of your job is not to be virtuous,
I want to bring us back to how gender plays into all of this. I realized, Ben and Tony, when I was reading your books, both of which deal with becoming a dad, that I don't think that I would like to read a memoir by a woman that talks about becoming a mother with the same enthusiasm. But I liked it that you guys did. And so maybe I am just a sexist, but I wonder if there are more of those topics that we would be willing to hear from writers of one gender or the other. Or maybe or why that might be. Maybe now we're too far into Oprah territory.
Well, I'm not a specialist, but as I always say, I don't think there is a women's literature, men's literature, a lesbian literature, Afro-American literature. There is a good literature and bad literature. So it's really difficult for me to answer this kind of question. I'm not a feminist, maybe it's not good for me, but...
I mean, I think it's true though. I think that there are certain topics and sort of ways of writing that are relegated to this realm of women's writing in a really sort of segregated off way. It's a problem. It's sort of like, do I really have to reject this kind of writing or this aspect of my femininity in order to be recognized as a writer? That's something that dudes have to deal less with. I think that well, the kinds of confessional writing that I really like from dudes are the ones that are really incriminating. They're really overblown, really bombastic. Here are all of the ugly aspects of my masculinity, and I'm admitting to them. Not the sort of reappropriation of a kind of vulnerability that, no offense to anybody sitting on this panel ever, but not the kinds of vulnerability that, women are reviled for in a certain kind of way, who are accused of being, too soft, too weak, or this is boring, we've heard this from a woman before, the story's already been told, I think it's really crucial to sort of hold men to that standard and say, well, what is it that men are hated for, and why don't you write about it? My friend Joseph Kaplan wrote this piece called How I Think It Happens,
which is really detailed, disgusting, overblown, bombastic accounts of how he thinks lesbians have sex. People hate this piece. He's read it at several locations. People get really uncomfortable and then they start laughing as they get funnier, and then they hate themselves for laughing. And that's the kind of confessional writing that I really want to start seeing from men, the kinds of incriminating things that women are often accused for being when they write about femininity or write about the feminine or in a feminine way, you know?
I have two thoughts about that. Your question, my wife's first book came out about 2 months ago. This is where I shamelessly plug my wife's book. But, and it has the same ending, which is, or nearly the same ending, which is the birth of our daughter. And she wrote it much better than I did. But people, you know, when talking about her book, they never really talked about that, the birth of our daughter. And people, when talking about my book, did talk about that. Maybe it was because I was an observer and a witness, and I was narrating a thing that was seen rather than experienced. But it may also be that people sort of shrugged their shoulders and said, yeah, you're a woman, you gave birth. Hadn't we read enough of that? I'm not sure. And in terms of bombastic male narratives and crazy behavior, I think my last book had quite a bit of that, probably too much of it, but I feel like if I was, at the end of that book, if rather than being happily married and about to witness my daughter being born, if I'd still been very suicidal, living alone in a cabin in the Catskills, drinking a lot, sometimes coming down to the city to do copious amounts of drugs, people would have been happier if I was still down in that gutter, and they could still kind of kick me around in the way that I kicked myself around in the book. And that may just be because I'm a paranoid writer, but I do believe that had, like, people don't really want a happy ending. Am I wrong?
I think your discomfort, or your kind of preemptive discomfort with reading a memoir by a woman about how great it is to be a mom, partly has to do with kind of gender roles and maybe kind of what you grew up with and what you maybe felt like is expected of you. I do think that people like Tony and myself who are writing about being a father now, that we're in this period where everyone's like, oh, it's really being a dad, that's great. I think that'll be over pretty soon. As fathers become more involved in their children's lives. But, you know, it wasn't too long ago that you know, like, the father wasn't there in the delivery room. He was like, you know, he was like somewhere else. He was at home or at work or at the bar or somewhere else. But, you know, fathers literally were not there for the appearance of their children, you know, and this is part of the reason why I felt compelled to write about my son's birth being there. And maybe Tony feels the same way.
Yeah, I was mostly a DJ on my iPad, but men weren't absent. And maybe you'll be more willing to listen to a female narrative about birth and motherhood soon, or not that you're not willing.
Wives, I will, yeah.
But because I push a stroller around Park Slope, and I feel like everyone there is so excited about being parents, and it's amazing. And I think, but people have been doing this a long time. You know? Maybe not with $1,500 strollers. I don't have one of those. I got mine on sale at Baby Zeros for $89. But like, maybe the celebration will come to an end soon.
I think it has to do with, Ben, what you said about writers going for what's not being said. And maybe the next round of books about parenting will be
From the baby's point of view.
from that's right, critiques. Yes. Well, I want to just find out if there are questions that you guys would like to ask each other, and then we'll kick it over to the audience if not. Okay. If there's any questions, you can come up to these mics, or you can stand and shout, whatever you prefer.
Question to Agata. Before you learned that you had been born of a Jewish mother, what was your feeling or views about Jews? And if so, was it different from after you learned about it? And did you have to make any transition of any conscious kind to become Jewish? Not just born Jewish, but culturally and traditionally and whatever it means to be a Jew.
So, as I said, I was born in Poland. I had Polish friends, Polish parents. I read Polish literature, and I thought Jews were killed during the war. I didn't realize that there are Jews in Poland. This might be strange to you. We're not taught at school about that. And I didn't know what a Jew should look like. That's why I didn't see a Jewish beauty in my mother. Now I can see it and I know what it is. So I heard a lot of anti-Semitic remarks in my life, in my childhood, adolescence, at school, and also by close members of my family. Of course, not on my mother's side. So I knew only one thing, that being Jewish is not good. It's something that you need to be ashamed of. And also I knew that Jews are responsible for all the evil in the world. And I didn't want to be Jewish. And it never occurred to me that it's possible. Because I thought Jews, were killed during the war. And then I remember when I was little, I was going with my mother to Kazimierz nad Wisłą over Vistula River. It was a shtetl, it's a beautiful little shtetl near Lublin. And I remember playing on a hill and finding in the earth little stones, little sculptures with hands and part of lions, etc. I didn't know it was a Jewish cemetery. I remember also in this little place, a beautiful cinema, weird cinema. I haven't seen this kind of buildings with a round roof, and it was a theater. I watched all my children's movie over there. After I learned it was a synagogue before the war. And also I remember from this little town, artists on the main market square, and they were selling pictures with this weird people with black, capotas, who are not weird people in black suits, weird hats. Later I find out they were Jews. So I didn't know anything about it, being a child and later on. When I discovered, when my mother told me, I didn't tell the world, but I started to learn about it. And what I invented, I took the books of Isaac Bashevis Singer and started to read them. There were not very many of them in Polish, but I read them in English and in French, because I wanted to learn, as you said, about Jewish past and Jewish history. I didn't know anything about it, religion, tradition, nothing, zero. And I learned a lot, and I started to read books. In the meantime, I wrote a book about Isaac Bashevis Singer and the Jews of Poland, which was also translated into English many years ago, because I wanted to learn about Jewish past. It was a very painful knowledge, I have to say, because I was traveling through Poland and I was trying to find out what was left from Singer's personal past and from the novels and stories that he described. So I went to Leoncin where he was born, I went to Radzymin, I went to Biłgoraj, where his family was from. Nothing. Very, very few traces. And people didn't remember Singer's family. So I had this idea also that I will write a letter to Singer. And I will tell him what Poland looks like now. But then I decided I'm not going to do it because it would upset him a lot. So I put a big effort to learn about Jewish past in Poland, about Jewish tradition. Then I came to New York in 1991. I spent here a year. I did a lot of interviews with Jews from Poland, people who knew Singer from before the war, and people who knew Jewish life in Poland before the war. And it gave me also a lot. And I was trying to understand, what does it mean to be Jewish? What is it, this Jewish identity? Am I Jewish? Weird kind of, I would say. Because I don't speak the language, I don't know the tradition. Now I know the tradition because I learn it, but I don't practice it. You know, I was born in Poland, I was baptized because my Polish grandmother decided so, but never went to church. So I'm not a religious person. So I cannot, maybe someone can, but I cannot start wearing a wig and being, a religious Jewish woman. So how am I Jewish now? I'm Polish because of the language, and this is the only language I write in. And I'm Polish because of the land and because of our literature. I live in this language, Polish language, but I'm Jewish because of the Holocaust, mostly. And in my family history of fear, I recreated my family I never had. I didn't have my Jewish grandmother because she was killed. I didn't have my other family from this side. So I decided to have it. That's why I wrote this book. Now I'm not afraid anymore, and I have family. I remember about them. This is another very important issue. I'm Jewish because they were killed, and I have to remember them. That's why also I decided to stay with Vera Grant, to listen to her and to remember and to tell the story.
I just want to thank everybody, first of all. It's fascinating. It's really wonderful. And to say about worrying about betrayal, I've written several memoirs. My mother would always introduce herself to friends by saying, I'm not as bad as the way Louise writes about me. So you never know the people you think you're betraying. It occurs to me, I know there isn't time to talk about it, but there are many different kinds of bravery. And I'm just sitting here listening, there's the kind of bravery that's, the emperor has no clothes, I'll tell the truth and all those things. I grew up, appropriately, in this place talking about the Holocaust, being told that Anne Frank wrote such a brave book. And since I'm Anne Frank's identical twin, it really resonated with me. And I wanted to ask or add to the conversation, some things become brave because of events in the world. It's my feeling, having read that book, I don't see what's so brave about it. It's brave because she died. That seems heretical to say, but I do feel that way. But there are events in the world that make writing look brave after the fact. And there's a lot of wonderful writing that came out of Sarajevo that I would call brave because of what happened there. So I wanted to add some different kinds of bravery conversation.
Yeah, I mean, when I'm writing in Park Slope, or when I used to write a few blocks away at 19th Street, I never thought of it as a brave act. There are places in the world where you will die for writing, and you will die for even thinking about writing, and you know, that's what Penn's mission is. That's a different kind of bravery, yeah, I think the work has to be in the world, and has to be read, and has to be considered culturally to get that, to receive that badge of bravery.
That question reminds me of something, Trisha, that you had emailed about before the panel, about a risk that you most admire in a writer being the risk to write something that calls into question their like career as a writer, or their craft. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I just, honestly, I read that email also because I just don't like the term brave. Like, I feel like there's something there that feels like it's trying to fix something, as though, like, bravery is a badge that we can put on something that's really painful, or a wound, or a really difficult, painful historical event, and feel like everything is okay. When it really isn't. I feel like oftentimes it really obscures the kinds of processes that we need to engage with, even though they're painful. And so I like to talk about stakes, and I like to talk about personal risks to an author, because I feel like it comes through in the work. And you know, when I wrote that about my other friend Joey Algazin, it's because he does a lot of work that's, I think, under-recognized for being bad, when conceptually it's really interesting. So I mean, that's a tangential thing, but that's how I feel about bravery.
What's the question?
Oh, great.
Hi, I just wanted to thank you again for a wonderful panel and speakers. But a word I noticed that has come up a lot within kind of the questions is truth. And the idea of writing about an event or people who are true, real, that have real consequences in real life, involvement and investments. And I was wondering if as writers you had struggled with that in your projects, especially with confessional writing and memoirs, and the idea of the role of truth within confessional writing, and if that was something you grappled with at all.
There's, yeah, sure. You know, the memoir is always getting slammed a couple times a year. I think you can like set your clock by it. Someone slams the memoir, and it's for different reasons sometimes. But I was thinking, you know, there's truth in terms of events. Like I'm guided when I'm writing, when I'm thinking about writing a memoir, by these things must have happened. Like I needed to have, say, gone to war. I needed to have actually been in that RV with my father when I said I was. And then there's, you know, the emotional truth of you know, my experience first of living that, and then of rendering it. And my like moment of emotional truth is, I think, what's important on the page. And I think everyone else here has sort of alluded to that as well.
Yeah, it's been interesting to hear people talk tonight, because I think whether it's transcripts of actual conversations in a confessional, or you know, looking at a film of your father, or like doing interviews, I think all of us have actually done a lot of journalistic work in trying to, like, you know, write memoir, which seems to me kind of an important part of the whole enterprise. I mean, there is a kind of you are trying to be true to actual sort of events, but at the same time, it's always your rendering of them and your memory of them that kind of trumps everything. But I do think it sounds like we're all writers who kind of do the work of trying to make sure that what you're describing, you know, first of all, actually happened, and second of all, trying to get different perspectives on it, so you can render it as fully as possible.
Well, for me it's very important, the word truth. As I said before, I don't think there's one truth. There's Vera Grant truth and Władysław Szpilman truth, and sometimes they are, not sometimes, they are completely different. And in this book, this is a problem. So that's why I'm saying that the most important hero of this book is memory. I'm trying to transcribe Vera Grant's memory about the events, about the war, about the Warsaw Ghetto. Spielmann wrote his book, his memoir, in 1946. And in his book, the personage, the singer Vera Grant, doesn't exist, which is the sign that his memory was completely different than hers. I'm sure that he remembered her because it was just 2 years before that they worked together and spent every day together. But for some reason, he didn't want to remember, or he didn't want to mention her, or he didn't want to put her in his book. So it is his truth. In his version of the story, Vera Grant doesn't exist. In her version of the story, the pianist exists in a very painful way, and I don't want to go into details with it, but if you're interested, please read the book and find out what was the conflict between those two wonderful artists.
Thank you guys so much. We're going to end here. We're out of time.
Can I get one more question?
Everyone will stick around for a minute, and you can, but we've got to get off the stage. Sorry. I do just want to remind you guys that the pop-up bookstore is at the Public Theater, and I want to thank this audience for making history and asking questions that were all actual questions. Thank you so much.